Hello, Adobe Illustrator fans. Today I'm going to be talking about two tools on the toolbar, the brush tool and the blob brush tool, two of my favorites. And we're just going to, hit the surface of what these two tools do. They're very powerful, and the more that you put into them, the more that you explore brush libraries, the more you can simply do. But let's just take a look at what they are basically intended to do, and you can take it from there. So we'll also talk about brush settings that are available to you and the brush libraries, but it's probably best to just jump in and start playing with these tools. So the paintbrush tool, basically, if you click and drag on the artboard, it allows you this free form brushing technique. And the blob brush, which is kind of interesting, I'm going to actually choose a little bit larger size so you can see what I'm doing. But the blob brush, well, at first it doesn't seem very useful if you can't be too creative and thinking about what you might do with this, but its behavior is different from the brush tool, and we can tell by selecting each of them. So the brush tool has created a stroke on the artboard, whereas the blob brush has created a filled shape on the artboard. So it's really handy for possibly filling paths that you've already created, especially if you've got this draw inside mode selected. So blob brush can be really helpful for a lot of things. And the other interesting thing about the paintbrush is that even after you've created a brush stroke on the artboard, you can add different characteristics to it. You can change the weight of it from the control panel, or you can select different brush definitions. Now we've got the default brush definitions here, and I'll just click on one so that you can see what that did. And if you increase the weight, it might be a little easier to see how that brush definition changed the stroke that we have on the artboard. So it's interesting that even after you create a stroke with the brush tool on the artboard, you can change its definition, you can change its characteristics and the way that it appears. And there are all types of brushes available to you. Now, of course, we only merely accessed the basics that come as default with Illustrator, but you can even choose, like this stroke characteristic looks a little bit more like what you would do with a calligraphy pen. And it's just simply because of the angle of that oval. And that's what made it have more of that calligraphy or that calligraphic style of line. The other thing that's interesting to note about brush characteristics is if you spend a lot of time working with the brush and building a character on the stage, or maybe you're doing some script writing and you intend to print it, you can't always guarantee that the printer is going to have in their cast of characters the same brush that you used, particularly if you get into these brush libraries and opening very specific types of brushes. You can't always guarantee they have the same brush as you do. So what you have to end up doing is expanding the appearance of the stroke. And to do that, one way is under Object and Expand Appearance. And now you can see what has happened to that stroke on the artboard. It is created very similar to the blob brush. It has created a filled path. And that is what you would need to do as you work or after you're done creating an illustration on the artboard. Sometimes it becomes necessary to expand the appearance of all of your different strokes so that they behave more as vector graphics as opposed to a stroke that just has an appearance assigned to it. So that's a little bit of just a brief overview of what these tools do. Of course, You can choose the brush that you intend to use before you start drawing. You can choose the brush tool, and you can go under the brush panels, which I will expand here so you can see it a little better. And if you don't like the stock brushes that you see here, there's a variety of brush libraries that you can choose from. By clicking on the brush libraries menu, you can come up with all types of different things. Let's say, okay, so we were kind of on this calligraphic mode. Why don't we choose from one of those brushes and expand this panel, which is not cooperating. So I can choose a brush before I use it, and then if I click on the artboard, I can see what kind of behavior I get from working with these different brushes and what the different angle does. And it just attempts to mimic a calligraphy pen, which would have a certain type of angle to it depending on how you're holding the pen. And some people develop a very specific way that they want to hold the pen. Now, some of these are much sharper, smaller. Also look at how this behaves on the artboard as I draw. When I unclick, I'm clicking and dragging, but when I unclick, Illustrator attempts to smooth that line for me. It says, okay, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you're not as shaky as you appear, and I'm going to go ahead and smooth out those lines for you. So a good idea when you're first experimenting with brushes is to pull up a variety of brush libraries and just kind of see what's available. If you go under Window, Brushes, you can then access those libraries if you don't already have a library up. Now the other interesting thing is the brush panel drop-down menu. You can create a new brush, you can save new brushes, and then if you add a bunch of brushes as you're working, let's say you decide that it's showing some of the brushes that we just worked with. You can trash brushes that you don't want by clicking on one and clicking on the delete brush. Or I can select a series of brushes that I like, and I can save them as my own personal brush library. So if I used a certain number of these calligraphy brushes and I decided that I liked them and I wanted to save them for future use, I could do that. So there's a lot of interesting options. If you wanted to save brushes, it opens up it's on your hard drive where this brush library would actually be saved. But you can actually save a brush file for future use. And it's just kind of interesting at first when you're playing with these brushes to just experiment, see what's available, and notice the different behaviors. In a later demo, in a later project, you will be able to work with the brushes and actually explore them in more detail and then add color. So initially when you're working with the brush, it's using the stroke. Can you change the color to that stroke? Well, you certainly could using your color menu or your swatches. You can definitely change the color of these strokes as you work. And then if you're finally happy with that, again, you can expand the appearance of the stroke, and it outlines it for you and it treats it as a filled object. So I encourage you to just try out the paintbrush tool and the blob brush tool and kind of see what kinds of things you can come up with, and noticing the different characteristics of one to the other, and practice using the brush tool to create something on the artboard, changing its appearance by selecting it, choosing different brushes, and then practice expanding the appearance of that stroke once you have created something that you like. And this concludes the quick and dirty introduction to the brush tools.